Hello, global trade champions. Let's grow together. Before we dive into today's topic, I want to take a moment to sincerely thank each and every one of you who has subscribed and is watching this video. It's because of your incredible support that our channel reached 1,500 subscribers in the 40 days. And now, we're on our way to 2,000. I am truly grateful for this amazing journey we're on. I promise to keep delivering even better content and doing my best to make this community stronger every step of the way. Today, we're diving into 4 essential pillars of maritime trade: FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF, the key conditions of Incoterms 2020. Last month, I released a video covering these terms, but this time, I've brought you something even better. Updated, refined content designed to make these concepts clearer and more actionable. In a sea of videos on Incoterms, I wanted to create something different, something practical, something that's truly going to help you navigate global trade with confidence and precision. This is not just another video. It's about delivering real value to you. You can download the presentation content in this video as a PDF file via the Google Drive link in description comments. To better understand the Incoterms 2020 for sea transport, I recommend watching the video first and then reviewing the PDF material. If you have any questions while going through the material, feel free to ask in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer them. Okay, now let's get started. In international trade, clear communication and well-defined responsibilities are crucial for successful transactions. Incoterms, international commercial terms, are standardized trade terms published by the International Chamber of Commerce, ICC, that provide clarity and predictability by defining the roles of buyers and sellers in international transactions. Incoterms 2020 are globally recognized rules that clarify the obligations, costs, and risks in international trade, simplifying cross-border transactions. Typically updated every decade by the ICC, the 2020 edition includes 11 terms, split between those for any mode of transport and those specific to maritime transport. Each term defines the responsibilities of the seller and buyer, the transfer of risk, and who handles transport, insurance, and customs. By using Incoterms, traders can avoid costly misunderstandings, ensure smoother operations, and better navigate the complexities of global commerce. Now let's take a closer look at each condition starting from FAS. FAS, free alongside ship, is an Incoterm in Incoterms 2020, which is used specifically for maritime transport. Under the FAS, free alongside ship term, the seller is responsible for delivering the goods to the specified port and placing them alongside the vessel. The seller must also take care of the export clearance and provide all necessary documentation for the shipment. The transfer of risk from the seller to the buyer happens once the goods are placed alongside the vessel at the port. After the goods are alongside the ship, the buyer is responsible for loading them onto the vessel, arranging the shipping and insurance, and managing any required import duties. Use FAS when the buyer handles the main sea or inland waterway transport, while the seller's obligation is to deliver the goods alongside the ship at the port of shipment. This is ideal for bulk cargo like grain or machinery, where the seller positions the goods next to the vessel and the buyer arranges for loading and further transport. The buyer takes over costs once the goods are alongside. For example, U.S. grain exporter delivers wheat to a port in New Orleans under FAS. The seller ensures the wheat reaches the port and clears export customs, but the Egyptian buyer arranges loading, shipping, and import procedures. In this case, FAS is appropriate because the buyer has control over the shipping and loading process while the seller fulfills its obligation by delivering the goods to the port and handling export customs. Next, let's look at FOB, free on board. FOB is a widely used term for sea or inland waterway transport. Under FOB, the seller's obligations are clearly defined. The seller must deliver the goods on board the vessel at the named port of shipment, manage export clearance, and provide all required documentation. Once the goods are on board the vessel, the risk transfers to the buyer. From that point onward, the buyer assumes responsibility for transportation, insurance, and any applicable import duties. FOB, free on board, is commonly used for sea or inland waterway transport when the buyer prefers to take on the responsibility and risk for the goods once they are loaded onto the vessel at the port of origin. The seller's obligations include delivering the goods to the port, managing export customs clearance, and ensuring the goods are safely loaded onto the designated ship. After the goods are on board, the buyer assumes all risks and costs, such as freight, insurance, and import duties. For example, if an Indonesian furniture manufacturer sells teak furniture to an Australian retailer under FOB terms, the seller is responsible for transporting the goods to the port in Jakarta, completing export clearance, and loading the goods onto the buyer's chosen vessel. Once the goods are loaded, the Australian buyer takes over responsibility for the freight to Sydney, insurance, and any import clearance. In this case, FOB is appropriate because the buyer prefers to have control over the shipping process from the moment the goods are on board the ship and is willing to manage freight and insurance. The seller benefits by only having responsibility up to the point of loading the goods, minimizing their risk during transport. Now, let's move on to the Group C terms of Incoterms 2020 for maritime trade, starting with CFR. In all Group C terms, including CFR, there is a distinction between when responsibilities and when risk transfer between the seller and the buyer. Under CFR, the seller's responsibility is to arrange and pay for the transportation of goods to the named port of destination and provide the necessary shipping documents and handle export clearance. However, the transfer of risk happens at a different point. The risk transfers from the seller to the buyer once the goods are on board the vessel at the port of origin. From that point forward, the buyer takes on the responsibility to bear the risk of loss or damage during transit and arrange for insurance if desired, and manage the unloading of goods, import duties, and any further transportation needed. CFR, cost and freight, is suitable when the seller arranges and pays for transportation to a specified destination port, but the buyer assumes the risk of loss or damage once the goods are loaded onto the vessel at the port of shipment. It is primarily used for sea and inland waterway transport and benefits buyers who want the seller to manage shipping costs but are willing to bear the risk during transit. For example, a South Korean steel manufacturer selling to an Indian construction company under CFR terms is responsible for delivering the goods to Busan port and paying for the sea freight to Mumbai. Once the goods are loaded onto a ship at Busan port, the risk transfers to the buyer, though the seller continues covering transportation costs. The buyer handles unloading, customs clearance, and further transport, and must also arrange insurance during transit, as CFR does not include it. Now let's move on to the fourth and final condition for maritime transport in Incoterms 2020 that we'll discuss today: CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. Under CIF, the seller's responsibilities include arranging and paying for both transportation and insurance to the named port of destination. Additionally, the seller must provide all necessary documents, such as the insurance policy and export clearance. The transfer of risk occurs once the goods are loaded onto the vessel. At that point, the buyer assumes the risk. Once again, the transfer of risk occurs once the goods are loaded onto the vessel. At that point, the buyer assumes the risk. From there, the buyer's responsibilities include managing the unloading of the goods, handling import duties, and taking care of any further transportation to the final destination. CIF, cost, insurance, and freight, is ideal when the seller arranges and pays for transportation to a designated port and provides insurance for the goods during transit. When the goods are loaded onto the vessel, at which point the risk transfers to the buyer. This term is commonly used for sea and inland waterway transport and benefits buyers who prefer the seller to handle both shipping and insurance costs, but are willing to assume the risk after the goods are loaded. For example, a Spanish olive oil producer selling to a Canadian distributor under CIF Montreal terms is responsible for transporting the goods to the port of Valencia, handling export clearance, and paying for freight and insurance. Once the goods are loaded, the risk transfers to the Canadian buyer, though the insurance covers any damage during transit. The buyer is then responsible for unloading, import clearance, and further transportation after arrival in Montreal. Today, we've uncovered the 4 pillars of sea freight under Incoterms 2020: FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF. Each of these terms isn't just a technicality. They're the foundation that shapes how global trade moves. They define responsibility, risk, and control in a way that empowers both the buyer and the seller. But here's the real takeaway. Mastering these terms isn't just about knowing the rules. It's about unlocking a more efficient, confident, and powerful way to navigate the global marketplace. When you truly understand these principles, you're not just shipping goods, you're driving your business forward. And that, champions, is how you create something remarkable in the world of trade. Thank you for watching today. I'm Untitled Mind, dedicated to bringing you valuable content on international trade, and you're watching Trade Wins Today channel. It's truly an honor to share this journey with you, and I can't wait to see you next time with even more helpful insights.